Greetings and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everybody's doing well this evening. This one's coming to you a little late tonight, a little later than I normally record. But to be honest with you, my palate is pretty well shot tonight. To be honest, I've tasted quite a few different bourbons today, and in general, my palate's just not quite the way I think it should be. But it's a good thing tonight we're doing the last of our standards of bourbon. And this is a bourbon that I'm actually somewhat familiar with, as some of you know. But tonight we are going to be looking at Buffalo Trace, good old Buffalo Trace bourbon. So this was my plan all along. So it actually works out that I can do a lot of this from memory, and I don't have to worry about tasting and so forth so much because I have drank quite a bit of Buffalo Trace in my time. Buffalo Trace is the flagship or namesake bourbon of the Buffalo Trace Distillery. Currently owned by Sazerac, Buffalo Trace has had a long history. It started all the way back in 1775 as the Hancock Lee Distillery. Later on, by 1812, there was a distillery there controlled by a gentleman named Harrison Blanton. But the real history really starts in 1870 when the property and distillery was taken over by Colonel E.H. Taylor. Taylor is one of the kind of the godfathers, if you will, of the bourbon world. And he is going to rename the distillery the OFC Distillery, the Old Fire Copper Distillery, and run it for quite a few years. Then he's going to sell that to George Stagg during a time of financial difficulty. It's going to be renamed the George T. Stagg Distillery, which will remain open all the way through Prohibition, selling medicinal spirits. Stagg Distillery is going to finally close in the early 1990s when it's going to sell off briefly to Ancient Age, and then within 2 years to Sazerac, the current owners, in 1992. And 1992 is going to be renamed Buffalo Trace. Several years later, in 1999, Buffalo Trace is going to introduce the brand Buffalo Trace Bourbon Whiskey. And so that's the little brief history of Buffalo Trace tonight. We do know that it uses Mash Bill 1, which is undisclosed according to their company policy. We do know that Mash Bill 1 is typically 10% or less of rye. And there is also no age statement. Also, but the rumor that has been around for a very long time is that they use barrels between 8 and 10 years old. And it is bottled at a fairly reasonable 90 proof. This is also considered a small batch. They use less than 40 barrels to barrel each batch of whiskey. I know it's really dark. It's getting hard to see. You're going to have to trust me that in the glass, this is just a great medium amber color. It has really nice lines on the glass when you swirl it around a little bit. Typically, lines I would assume with a little lines I would associate with a little bit higher proof. They really stick well to the glass. The nose. This ticks a lot of boxes for me for a great bourbon smell, and maybe that's just my familiarity with it. You get a lot of oak smells. That vanilla and caramel is definitely there. But under that, I'm also getting a little hint of spice, probably some allspice or maybe a little nutmeg. But there's also a really pleasing hint of honey. As for the taste of Buffalo Trace, it's going to lead with just a little bit of spice on the tip of the tongue. So a little of black pepper, but not much. It's not off-putting at all. In fact, it turns out to be a very sweet bourbon on the palate. At least it does for me. Following that hint of black pepper on the tongue, I'm getting lots of caramels and vanillas, all classic notes of bourbon. But even better for me is the hints of brown sugar, the toffee, And I think that really overwhelms the rye spiciness that is in this. So I think the sweetness by far really, yeah, it really overpowers the spiciness that sweetness does. It's just an all around great taste. So, finish, I would call this a medium finish. It doesn't last particularly long. It's not really short. Gives me a nice little warm upper chest feeling. It doesn't come way down in the chest. Right here at the base of the throat. Got a good little nice burn. But I'm getting a little oak here. This is where that caramel and vanilla comes back in. But there's also a little hint of sweet cinnamon in that. So, full disclosure, this has been my favorite everyday drinker for quite some time. I have also always known it's not the best bourbon out there. But like I said a few moments ago, it checks a lot of the boxes for me for being a really good bourbon. I think it's a bourbon that a lot of people could drink and say, hey, I like that. That's a good bourbon. Again, it's not the best, and it's not going to be. But as a flagship namesake bourbon of a distillery, you have kind of you have to have something that says to people, this is good. But it also can't be too expensive. And I think that's where Buffalo Trace really comes into its own. It's a sub $30 bottle of bourbon. When I first started drinking this, I could buy it as low as $15. $17 was fairly common. Then it hit 23, and now it hits anywhere between the 25 to $30 range. And I think it's still a good price for the bourbon. I think it's a good deal for a quality bourbon that doesn't really offend many people. It doesn't have super deep notes, but the notes that are there are incredibly satisfying. So, how am I going to rate this on the Karl scale? Again, trying to leave favoritism out of this. I really think Buffalo Trace, because it's just a solid drinking bourbon, and I think it's one that stands up well in cocktails. I think it's one that stands well neat. I think it's one that stands well with ice. And I think a lot of people can drink this and say it's a good bourbon. I'm going to go with a 4.25 stars. That's 4.25 stars on the Karl scale. It's just a very likable bourbon. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry for the delay tonight. I hope everybody is well. Hope everybody is safe. And, of course, peace and happy pours.